my name is Fluin. I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team. I always like to tell people about why I exist and what I'm trying to do. So I really have two parts to my mission. The first part is I want to help developers be successful with Angular. So everything from making sure that the problems that you're running into are solvable, helping to write documentation, all those sorts of things. But then the second part of my mission is really understanding what's going on in the real world and then reflecting that back into the team so that we're making the right decisions when it comes to the next feature that we're going to build or the next way that we're going to evolve the framework. So I'm going to give a couple of things here. I'm going to give a very brief update on just this kind of state of Angular. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming up in version 4, which I know we're all very excited about. So the brief update, because most of our time is now thinking about forward and looking towards the future, but the brief update of what's been happening over the last month or so. There's two new features in the CLI that we've shipped. The first is what we call the eject button, and then the second is some experimental support for service workers. And so, how many people here have used the Angular CLI? Okay, that's probably most of you, which is really exciting, because we definitely believe that CLI is a great way to build Angular applications. It's not the only way, but what we're trying to do with the CLI is really abstract a lot of the complexity away for you that just makes you able to focus on what you're doing and what you're building. So the first thing that we're doing is to solve a problem that a lot of companies, or it causes a lot of companies kind of a little bit of fear or trepidation around Angular CLI, which is, hey, what if I need to go in and change the configuration that CLI has? And so historically, if you wanted to add another loader to Webpack, or if you wanted to change what was happening under the hood of the CLI, we didn't actually let you do that. And that's intentional, and that's very explicit, because there's a lot of innovation going on right now in the world of module loaders and bundlers. So for example, Chrome and all of the browsers, we don't actually ship the ES6 module import syntax yet, but that might come at some point in the future. And if that comes, all of the module bundlers and all the loaders are going to want to change to match what actually ends up happening in the browser. And so there's a lot of change in the world, and by abstracting that away from you, by having the CLI be a little bit of a black box, this actually benefits you, because that means if the module loaders do change, we can actually change all of that for you, because you're not exposing or changing the configuration. So we can be very confident that things are going to continue to work. So that's intentional, but at the same time, there are cases where you want to go in and tweak things, right? You need that level of flexibility. So we added what we call the eject button into the CLI. And what the eject button does is it allows you to basically stop using the CLI for commands like serve and build. And so what we do is we write out to disk a Webpack configuration that is what is, the CLI is using under the hood. And then from then on, instead of running ng build or ng serve, you have an npm run build or npm run serve that just uses the underlying Webpack configuration. So hopefully that actually increases CLI adoption. There's a lot of challenges that you can run into once you've injected, right? Because you're not going to have all the benefits that we give you in terms of keeping those things up to date if you made modifications. But that's an important thing for the community that we felt would be amazing. Another thing that, and I do have to warn, this is somewhat experimental, but I used it on a bunch of different sites that have gone into production for conferences and things like that. And it's relatively stable, and that's support for service workers or progressive web applications. So for those of you that don't know, progressive web applications are a way of building a web application in a little bit of a better way, a way that gets progressively enhanced if your browser has additional features. And commonly those features are things like offline, because the service worker, which is just a web worker basically on steroids with some additional permissions and some additional APIs, that allows you to install code into the user's device. So if you've ever been to a website that says, would you like this website to allow notifications, right? So Slack does this, Facebook does this. That's using a service worker under the hood, because what it allows them to do is a bunch of different things. So one of the features is push notifications. So if you hit yes to allow, that's a push notification. If you loaded that application and you didn't have an internet connection and it kept working, that's another very important thing that Service Worker allows you to do, because it actually runs a process on the device that acts, or a JavaScript process effectively, that intercepts all of the traffic, all the HTTP traffic that comes from your application. And so when the user goes to mywebsite.com/, we can actually say, hey, I have this installed application that knows how to respond to that. And before it even goes up to the internet connection, I can respond to that request and say, here's what I want you to serve. What this means is my web app that has been functioning and requiring an internet for the entire life of my development, or my entire life as a developer, now it just works offline. And that's kind of a magical moment once you've taken advantage of it. And what we've done in the CLI is we've actually added a setting So you can see the two commands here. So you've got ng eject, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then you've got a configuration. So in your Angular configuration, your Angular CLI.json file, there's now a service worker which you set to true. And then what that does is when you do a production build, it's actually going to look at your application, look at all the files that are rendered by the CLI and by Webpack, and it's going to save all those files as part of a manifest that then the service worker gets shipped with your application, gets installed when the user first visits the website, and then anytime a request comes in from one of those files, we can serve it instantly. And so there can also be a very ginormous performance improvement if you're loading the application the second or third time, in addition to those offline capabilities. So this is very exciting time for the CLI and for service workers, etc. One warning I will have is if you're giving a demo, don't start with ng eject. I did that last week at a meetup, and it was someone had asked a question about ng eject, and I'm like, oh yeah, let me show you. And then someone asked another question, I said, oh, I can't quite demo you anymore because this ng-serve doesn't work. So pro tip for everyone here. All right, but what I think you really want to hear about is what's coming up next, and this is 4. How many people have tried 4? So we're actually, as of today, we are in RC2 we've released, so that we've released 2 versions of 4 that we believe are relatively feature complete and stable. And we really are trying to validate in a large scale way what's going on within your applications works within Angular. And so something that we talk about a lot at many different conferences that still kind of we haven't gotten the message across very well is that every version of Angular that we release, so that's everything from betas, RCs, minors, things like that, every version of Angular has actually already been validated within Google. And so how Google works is we have a mono repository, so all of our code lives in one place. And so what happens is every time we make an update to Angular and sync that into the system, we have to be responsible to make sure that that works across every single one of those applications. And so if we break some of their tests, their unit tests or their end-to-end tests, we're actually responsible for fixing it. So every release we put out, we're actually very confident in that it works for all of Google across more than 100 projects. And so what ends up happening is we've already validated these things within Google and our kind of Google scale problems, but we want to make sure that it works for all the use cases that we haven't thought of. And so if anyone's willing to try the RC, it's relatively simple. And I thought, hey, maybe as an experiment, why don't we give installing version 4, upgrading an application to version 4 a try. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take the CLI, and I'm going to ng new, a new project. So what this is going to do is this is going to go out using the CLI, it's going to scaffold out a project, it's going to figure out, okay, here's my package JSON, here's all the tests I want to build, here's my main file, and then it's going to go ahead and install all of those dependencies using Yarn here for that. Use npm in a second. What we can do now is we can actually open that project here. So we've just created this project called 4. I'll make this bigger so everyone can see. Hopefully that's big enough. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into my application here. And I'm going to say, instead of AppWorks, let's say, I meet up. Let's save that, and let's actually serve this. So what this should do, if I've done everything right, is it's going to start up a CLI server. And actually, because I did an ng new by default today, the latest stable version of Angular is 2.49. And so what we see if we switch over to Chrome here, and we load localhost 4200, hi meetup. The application works. And this is tiny, so you probably can't see it, but under the hood you can actually, I've got a Chrome extension that tells me this is running Angular 2.49. Right? So that's the latest version you've been keeping out to date. But now I want to try something a little bit different. I'm going to use a single npm install command that's basically going to take all of the Angular packages, and you can actually see this if you type ng version. So 2.49 for common compiler, core, forms, HTTP, etc. And in one command, I'm going to update all of the versions of those packages to at next. And then I'm also going to install TypeScript at latest. And so what this should do is it will update all my dependencies, it will update all of my packages, but I haven't really touched a single line of my application. But let's go ahead and try ng serve again here. And if this demo's going to blow up, this is where it's going to blow up. Just a warning. Compiled successfully. The application still works. And so that's a big deal. So we've spent a lot of time and energy to make sure that every change that we made between the 2 and 4 version is very targeted at understanding what pain it's going to cause to real-world developers. And so I think we've done a pretty good job of making, I mean, this is obviously a very simple application, but for most applications, the upgrade should be relatively straightforward, and I'll actually talk about what that means. So, you've seen Angular 4 now. You've seen us upgrade from 2, a project that was brand new. We're done, right? No, but so it's exciting to be able to upgrade your application very seamlessly and very easily with very few breaking changes. But what you guys care about is features. What are the actual benefits to you as a developer for adopting the latest version? And so I've called out 6 here, and I'm going to go through each one and talk a little bit about why we did it and kind of what benefit you should expect to see. So the first thing is the view engine. And so for those of you that don't know, the view engine is a part of Angular that takes your templates, so this HTML that you write, this declarative syntax that we've designed for you guys, and then turns it into JavaScript. So when you write ngIf or ngFor, or when you do a property binding or an event binding, that's actually turned into JavaScript. And so when you, after you do either the JIT compilation or if you're doing ahead of time compilation, what you're actually running in the browser is JavaScript. So instead of seeing that template that you drew, you're actually going to see document.createElement or something similar to that. And so what we did in, so if you looked inside your code, right, if you did an ng-build-prod-snm for source maps, you could actually look at your application, see where all of the parts of your application are coming from. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do better on is making Angular itself and all of the applications you build with it smaller. And so this is why we, for example, have ahead of time compilation, so you don't have to ship down a compiler down to the user. So you can be running that whole process at runtime. But part of what ends up happening is because we do that code generation, you actually have all of these generated files for all of your templates and all your modules. And before, those templates and that generated code, those ng factories as we call them, were about 10 times the size of your template. So we take a very short, very simple declarative syntax and we turn it into this generated code. But what we did between 2 and 4, and this should be entirely seamless to every developer, is we actually rebuilt the view engine. And so the generated code that you build in 4 is going to look completely different. But our goal, and what I think we've been very successful at, is you shouldn't care and you don't even need to know about it. But what this means for developers is that instead of generating code that is 10 times the size of your template, we're now about 3 times the size of your template. So even though we're adding all those bindings, all that dependency injection, all that functionality, your code now is much smaller. And so what that does to your generated code is it goes to about 40% the original size. And I'll give an example of this. But this was a chart posted by, I think, Hans on the CLI team, where an application with, I think it was 1,000 components was at around between 225 and 300. As of 4, that jumps down to 40% of the size previously. So if you extrapolate this, we're going to be negative by version 5, which I'm really excited about those negative file sizes. And then I did want to take a sample application. So this is my personal website that I maintain. And so it doesn't have a ton of components, but it is a real world use case because it has a CMS and things like that behind it. And so this small set of components in 2 was about 82 KB of generated code. And then I did no changes to the application whatsoever, and I ran it in 4, and it was 35 KB. So that is a big improvement, and part of why I think developers in general kind of love Angular is because we're trying to make it a platform where we can take care of things that you don't have to worry about. And so our intent with kind of each release and every time we make a change is we're really doing it for the benefit of developers, to make your lives easier in the long term, to make your applications run faster, and to make your users happier. And so I think you should expect to see more of these sorts of things where suddenly you're able to do something you weren't able to do before, or the framework has gotten better in some way without a lot of work on your part. One of the things we've done that is kind of a mixed blessing in some ways is we've actually taken the animations, which used to be part of core, and moved them into their own package. And so this has 2 effects. If you don't use animations, so you're not animating in between your router changes or pulling in any of your MD cards or anything like that, you'll actually save about 38 KB that used to be in Angular core and it's now in Angular animations that you don't have to pull in. But if you do want animations, this is unfortunately a small breaking change, and so you'll have to npm install animations, and then you'll pull that into your ng module. So not a huge amount of work, so you just need to import it and then add it to the ng module imports. And then everything will just work as it did before, and you'll have about the same bundle size. So we haven't decreased the bundle, or increased the bundle size for anyone that's still using animations. Another big change that we did is we moved from TypeScript 1.8 to version 2.1. And so this is a really long list that I don't want anyone to read. I'm not going to read or talk about any of these things. TypeScript keeps getting better. So Angular itself is written in TypeScript. And your applications tend to be written in TypeScript because you're able to take advantage of all the kind of cool tools and toys that we have, like language services. And so what we did in the latest release is we've released now Angular is based on TypeScript 2.1. The benefit for you, if you think about it from more of an aggregate perspective, is that your applications will compile faster and you'll have access to all these cool new TypeScript features. And so all of these were pulled directly off the TypeScript website. You can definitely go read about those things. One thing I will say is that the version that we use to build Angular doesn't necessarily have to be the version that you use in your application. And so I know a lot of developers that use the latest version of Angular. So perhaps they're on 2.4.9 or perhaps they are on the latest RC, which is RC2 of version 4, but they still install the latest version of TypeScript, which is 2.2 or 2.3 coming up. Right, Alex? So the next benefit of Alex is on the TypeScript team at Google. Another thing that we've done to make application development better for developers that a lot of companies and a lot of teams are going to take advantage of this, but I think there's also some larger companies and some larger enterprises that are going to take advantage of it. And this is the concept of strict null checks. So in this new version of TypeScript, they've added a feature where if you're using the older version of TypeScript, or if you're using TypeScript in kind of the default mode, any type that you supply could also be a null, right? So if I have a hello object or a person object, when I assign that to a variable and I say let person equal or let me of type person, that could also be a null. It doesn't have to be a type person, it could be a null, it could be a undefined. And so that can create a lot of different mistakes in your application when you're building these large scale systems. I think someone famously called the null like it was $1 billion mistake. I forget who it was, but there's a lot of use cases when you're building large applications where getting rid of the ability for these things to be implicitly null or implicitly undefined can be very helpful. And so with this shift from TypeScript 1.8 to 2.1, we've now actually made all of Angular compatible with strict null checks, which means that you can enable that within your application. And so that means if I say let me of type person, it cannot be null when it's used. Right? So TypeScript is going to throw a compilation error if you try and throw null into that object. And so this, if you're building large-scale applications, can help you make your application better. But as a prerequisite for doing that, we had to make Angular compatible with this mode as well. So here's some examples of that. So you've got let x of type number, let y of number or undefined, or let number type null type undefined, right? So it could be any of these three things. And they've got various combinations of assignment is always going to be okay, but then assignment to undefined is not okay. These are all kind of the edge cases, right? You don't run into these day 1. But maybe day 10 or day 11 or day 1,000 of your application, you get into these weird errors where you're going to lose a day or 2 days if you don't have these sorts of features and these sorts of capabilities. Another of the big changes is to Angular Universal. So one of the things we did a few months ago was we actually took an open source project that was led by a great community member, or a couple great community members, Patrick JS, Jeff Wefley, who were building this thing that allowed you to render Angular on the server side, or what's known as Angular Universal. And then what we did is we said, hey, this project is fantastic. It's sometimes hard for the community to keep up with what we're doing. And so what we did is we kind of lent our support to it. And so we moved it into the Angular GitHub repository. And now we're making sure that it works with every kind of new version. And so the biggest change that came with that is now Angular Universal, most of the code actually lives in what's called Platform Server. So anyone that builds an Angular application, you've probably seen something called Platform Browser. So that's all of the things that you need to actually run within a browser context. Now we have this thing called Platform Server, which was there before, but now it has this very, very helpful method called render module factory. And what you can do is you load your Angular application within Node, or within any sort of Node application. And then what happens is you pass in the module factory, so this is post AOT, right? And what we do is we take a document, so an indexed HTML rendered as a string or rendered to a string, and we actually run your Angular application with that indexed HTML file. And then instead of returning it to a screen or rendering it within a browser, we're actually going to give you a static string. And so the promise and the benefit of doing this with Angular is that if you want to, for example, for performance reasons, you want to pre-render everything to HTML, or if you're working with a search engine that's not capable of running JavaScript, you might want to do this. Or if you want, for example, a little Twitter preview, right? When you share a link to Twitter, it actually renders the page, but it only renders HTML, it doesn't render JavaScript yet. So these are all reasons you might want Angular Universal. And so now that has been brought in as a core part of Angular as platform server. And we've tried to make a really nice API that makes it very easy to run your application and actually get out that string that then you can serve to the user or cache or do whatever you want with that. And I'll share the slides later, but I've got this GitHub URL where Rob Wormald has actually built a demo of this with all the Node and Express bindings that you might want to run that. But we expect every developer to want to put this in a different framework about how they want to serve that, how they want to integrate that with their whatever backend they're building. So the last change that I want to talk about is what I affectionately call the enhanced ngIf, which is coming soon. There's a version of it in the current RC, but we're actually making some changes to make it more ergonomic that we feel like developers are really going to like. So all this is, I have a tiny little asterisk down there, subject to change. So if it doesn't land exactly like I say here, please don't come and write me angry notes on Gitter. So the first thing we've added is what's called an as, or what I call an as. So here you've got a div where I've got an ngIf statement. So we often use ngIf to check to see if an observable has come back or what the state of it is. So here I'm saying user observable, pipe async, just like I normally would. But now I've got this new syntax within my ngIf called as user. And so before, if I wanted to use that observable, I would actually have to either subscribe multiple times by putting it in parentheses, user observable pipe async, .name, or question mark .name, for example, to check that existence, and then I would get 2 HTTP requests. If I was doing that by HTTP, I would get 2 subscriptions, which can have a lot of side effects. But this new syntax that we've added, as user, actually saves the result of that expression and allows you to use it. So what will happen is this div will only be rendered if user observable pipe async is truthy, and if it is truthy, we'll give you access to that observable so you don't have to keep subscribing to it. So anyone that's worked with observables, this is a really big deal, and it's going to make the syntax for working with observables much shorter and much easier to understand what's going on. We've actually added another thing to the ngIf statement, so which is the else. So a lot of I, as a developer, I've oftentimes said, hey, here's what I want to happen if it's true, here's what I want to happen if it's false. And right now I'm copying that entire condition and then adding a not in front of it, which is really poor semantics and violates dry and all sorts of things. So now we've got, I'm going to take that same exact example where we have user.name. So user observable pipe async as user, and I'm going to throw a semicolon in there, and I'm going to say else loading. And what this does is loading is a template reference. And so you'll see that in the element below. We've got ng template, hashtag loading. What that does is that hashtag loading defines this template and gives it a name. It creates a local template variable. And then we're referring to that template reference in loading. And so what happens is if the if statement passes, then we're going to render user.name. If the if statement does not pass, then you're going to see loading users, ... So this is another example where we're really trying to make things easier to use these very common use cases. And then I believe the last example here is the same as syntax, but now applied to an ng-for. And so we've all had this repeater concept where I say let user observable pipe async, right? So that automatically in that today in 249 gives you access to the item from the iterator, repeated for every li, so you can see user.name there below. But what this actually gives me is a couple new things. So now I can add as user after the user observable pipe async, and that actually gives me access to the collection. So I didn't have access to the collection before. I only had access to the item. But now I have access to the collection, and that allows me to do things like render users.length. And we've also updated and improved the syntax for saying give me an index. Right before I believe it was let I equals index, but now you can say index as I. So you're using the same as syntax, and then it's very easy to say here's the user's name, here's the number in the collection, or the iterable, and then here's the total length of the iterable. So you can see kind of how this could be beneficial to developers. So that was a brief preview of what's going on in 4. To kind of summarize, we've tried to make it smaller, which then means faster on slow internet connections, and we've tried to make it easier to use. And very easy to update so that it's not a lot of stress to be able to take advantage of these things. So we're very excited to share 4 with the world, and it's definitely coming soon. Thank you, guys.
Hey there. Do you use Angular? Do you like fun in the sun? And how do you feel about boats? If you're nodding yes, then come join us on NG Cruise to learn more about Angular while on a fabulous Caribbean cruise. Check out ngcruise.com for speaker lineup, workshop details, and to book your spot today.